Hi, so this video is going to go through the important information you'll need to be successful for Module 6, World War II. First, here is our pacing guide. This is available within the module. You have 3 assignments this week, and I would highly suggest you break them down into the first assignment being done on Tuesday and Wednesday, the second assignment being done on Thursday, and then the final assignment being done on Friday. So Monday, all you need to do is check and make sure you've gotten all your work complete. So the assignments for this module include the World War Again essay assignment, which is worth 50 points, World War II, the U.S. role, which is a reading comprehension activity, which is also worth 50 points. And then finally, 2 wars, a reading and discussion response worth 20 points. First, I'm going to go through the information you'll need for your essay for the World War Again assignment. If you remember correctly, at the end of our last module, we had been talking about the Great Depression and the New Deal. And despite Franklin Delano Roosevelt's hope that the New Deal would end the Great Depression, it really hadn't. However, it did reinforce the idea that the U.S. needed to concentrate on domestic problems rather than foreign affairs. So even while the U.S. turned inward, all around the world, other things were happening. In Europe and Asia, forceful leaders, possibly even fascist leaders, were taking place or taking hold in Germany and Italy. And Japan, under Emperor Hirohito, was establishing more and more military strength. So the first thing we're going to do is investigate how the U.S. was drawn back into the world stage. We're going to focus on how, following World War I, we shifted from isolationism back to interventionism in the 1930s and the different events that caused the U.S. involvement. So first, we need to look at what happened that kind of led to World War II. Now, at the end of World War I, all of the powers sat around and came up with the Treaty of Versailles. But the conversation had really been dominated by Great Britain, France, and the United States, and really left out Italy and Japan. And the results of the Treaty of Versailles did a significant amount of punishment of Germany and its allies. However, the U.S. never actually ratified the Treaty of Versailles. As I mentioned, dictators started coming into power. 2 of the most prominent were Benito Mussolini, who's pictured here on the left, and Adolf Hitler on the right. These fascist movements became very powerful in the 1930s and the 40s. These dictators came to power because of those negotiations following World War I that really placed severe economic, territory, military, and psychological constraints on Germany. As the U.S. went through the roaring 20s, having unprecedented economic success, Germany suffered from inflation and national debt. And a lot of the problems were caused by the reparations forced to pay the Allies. The Great Depression didn't just hurt the United States, but also the entire global economy. And as the U.S. continued to deal with the concerns at home, Europe had already started marching towards war. So how did Mussolini get to power? Well, after Europeans were dealing with such terrible conditions, some turned to a form of government called totalitarianism. Totalitarian regimes controlled more than just the government. They ran the economy, and they even controlled the citizens' minds and actions. They had secret police and military police to enforce their laws. Italy had become a totalitarian state back in 1922, and he really based his government on fascism. And fascist government combined this concept of extreme nationalism as well as a strong military force and the complete repression of democracy. Adolf Hitler also was a dictator that came to power. As I mentioned, Germany was decimated by the conditions placed upon it following World War I. The years of problems really destabilized the democratic government. And Adolf Hitler, who was very charismatic, came to power in the late 20s. He had been a soldier, but yet he had joined the Nazi Party and spread this idea that Jewish people were to blame for all of Germany's problems. He actually was imprisoned after the Nazi rebellion, and he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which detailed parts of his life, but more importantly, really described his political beliefs, and especially that anti-Semitism that permeated the Nazi mindset. Nazis gained power. Hitler gained political and emotional control because the public was so desperate following World War I that they were looking for anything to answer their problems. He enticed the middle class with a promise of order. Bankers and industrialists followed his ideas because he opposed communism. And he really wanted to enlarge and rearm the military, which made him popular with former soldiers and unemployed. And by the mid-30s, he'd become chancellor, president, and dictator. As he became the Führer, or sole leader of Germany, he started doing some things that were very concerning. It wasn't so far in the rearview mirror that World War I, that Europeans weren't reminded of all the horrors. And then Germany signed a treaty of friendship with Italy in 1936. And that same year, they formed a military alliance known as the Axis Power, creating quite the pair. And remember, alliances caused a lot of issues in World War I. So it looks like this was kind of history repeating itself, especially when Japan also joined the alliance. Hitler began vicious crackdowns on Jews in Germany. He began to rebuild the German military, even though the Treaty of Versailles had prohibited this. When civil war broke out in Spain, Germany supported another fascist dictator named Francisco Franco. And Mussolini, at the same time, was growing the Italian military and went so far to invade the African nation of Ethiopia. And nobody checked this aggression. The League of Nations, which the United States did not belong to, didn't have any power to force these countries to stop what they were doing. British and French leaders didn't want to confront Germany. Instead, what they did was they tried to give in to some demands and try to keep the peace. And the United States, because they were so busy with the Great Depression, pretty much ignored all of it. Meanwhile, Hitler began expanding Germany's territory by taking over Austria and starting to take over other places called like Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. And Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain said, we want to avoid war. World War I, there was so much life lost. And in fact, he went so far in the summer of 1938 to say, in war, whichever side may call itself the victor, there are no winners, but all are losers. Later that year, Great Britain, France, and Italy signed the Munich Pact with Germany. The agreement gave Germany that land in Western Czechoslovakia, and the hope was that that would achieve lasting peace. However, Germany wanted to continue to expand. In the meanwhile, the U.S. was really promoting a foreign policy of isolationism. Isolationism had long been popular in the United States, and we talked earlier this quarter about why. Geography favors isolationism for the United States, as we're only bordered with Canada and Mexico, neither of which had ever attacked the U.S. And even before World War I, many Americans wanted to focus in on our own country and not be involved in foreign policy. In 1920, when President Warren G. Harding became president, he wanted to return to normalcy, which avoided foreign alliances. And even though his administration was very short, he wanted to try to lessen the chance of another global conflict. There were some different things that kind of contributed to this idea of isolationism. One was the Nye Committee. In the late 20s and early 30s, some books and articles said that arms manufacturers had really pushed the United States into World War I to increase their profit. And these rumors were floating around. So in 1934, the Senate created a commitment to investigate, to make sure that anytime the United States was involved in a war, it was a matter of national honor and national defense, but not profit. They didn't find anything, but it really caused an increased support for isolationism. And thus created the opportunity for Congress to pass the first neutrality acts. So the first neutrality acts were passed in 1935 and 36, which prevented Americans from lending money to any nation that was at war, and also prevented the United States from selling any weapons or arms to nations who were currently engaged in war. And the law didn't differentiate between who was the aggressor or who was the country they invaded. Basically, the United States was not going to sell weapons or lend money to anyone who was engaged in fight. In 1937, Congress passed another Neutrality Act. Under this act, U.S. ships could not carry passengers or goods to nations at war. Americans couldn't travel on ships to or from nations at war. The only addition to this act was the cash and carry policy, and this was requested by President Roosevelt. Under this policy, the U.S. could sell military supplies to countries at war, but the nations at war, whoever was buying the products, had to transport the supplies themselves, and they had to pay for everything in cash. And this policy was a 2-year policy. Neutrality was harder to maintain when things started happening and kind of started heating up in Asia. So Japan began to really expand their military. This feeling of nationalism was really permeating Japan, and in 1931, they invaded Manchuria because they wanted more natural resources. They wanted coal and iron ore. And then in 1937, Japan invaded China. President Roosevelt really wanted to support China and got around Congress, as well as many Americans' desire to remain neutral by refusing to invoke the Neutrality Acts. He took action because neither country had actually declared war, and he basically was providing them with weaponry because China paid for supplies, and then British ships were used to carry supplies to the Chinese. Of course, this angered people who wanted the United States to remain in isolation from foreign alliances and foreign affairs. However, pretty soon, events all around the world were going to prevent the United States from staying that way. So in 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union made plans to divide Poland. The Soviet Union said it was okay for Nazis to invade Poland as long as the Soviet Union could control the eastern half of that nation. And so on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. On September 3rd, France and Great Britain declared war on Germany, and World War II had officially begun. The Third Neutrality Act was passed by Congress in 1939 in response to that invasion. The law ended the ban on selling arms to foreign countries. Britain dominated the Atlantic Ocean, so this law essentially allowed the Allies to purchase war goods as long as they paid cash and took them away on their own ships, kind of an extension of that cash and carry policy. Many Americans weren't excited about this change, and they really thought that neutrality was the only way to stay safe as Americans. Now, President Roosevelt had already begun to speak out against isolationism after Japan's attack on China. He really felt like the war and its effects were going to impact the United States no matter what. However, a majority of the public still opposed becoming involved in the war. But Roosevelt really favored the Allies, France, Poland, the United Kingdom at the start of the war over Germany and Italy and Japan's alliance. And that passage of that last Neutrality Act of 1939, where British ships and British allies were able to buy arms from the United States, really showed that. Roosevelt actually was elected again in 1970, and he promised during his campaign that he would maintain neutrality. However, that threat of the axis of powers in Europe, he was working behind the scenes to help Great Britain. Roosevelt bypassed Congress and signed an agreement exchanging 50 old battleships for the right to use 8 British military bases. The president was also working to oppose Japan. He put economic sanctions against Japan and put an embargo, which means a refusal, on the sale of scrap metal and other war goods. And after he won re-election, he quickly moved to get even more support for allies. He argued that helping democratic governments was more important than keeping the nation neutral. He actually said, "No realistic American can expect from a dictator's peace, international generosity, or return to true independence, or world disarmament, or freedom of expression, or freedom of religion, or even good business. Such a peace would bring us no security for us or our neighbors." President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill were very, very close friends, even before the United States entered the war. Roosevelt and Churchill began exchanging letters in 1940, and later they met secretly in Newfoundland, Canada, where they signed an agreement supporting national self-determination and democracy. The following year, Churchill even spent Christmas at the White House, and the leaders remained close friends until Roosevelt passed away. Another act that influenced the United States' involvement and increasing involvement in World War II was the Lend-Lease Act. This act allowed the president to sell arms or provide defensive aid to other nations without those nations having to pay cash. So it was kind of the Lend-Lease was the end of cash and carry. So Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union became the largest recipients of Lend-Lease aid and support. Many Americans were still dead set on isolationism and weren't big fans of Roosevelt's policies of intervention. Yet most people realized that the chance of the U.S. involvement in this war were getting higher and higher. And by the time the war had kind of erupted in late 1939, a poll actually showed that 75% of Americans expected to be drawn into the war at some point. But that doesn't mean they wanted to. In 1940, 2/3 of citizens still wanted to keep out of the war. Gerald Nye was the founder of this America First committee, where basically we're saying no more involvement. We want to keep our nation out of the war. And members of this group included future President Gerald Ford and aviator Charles Lindbergh. However, events in Europe and Roosevelt's policies began to kind of change the idea of isolationists. As Germany started taking on more and more territory, including conquering France in 1940, Americans realized that this was going to be big. Congress actually passed a law authorizing a peacetime draft. And like I told you before, Roosevelt was reelected once again in a landslide. 1941, we were still officially neutral, but that neutrality was very biased. Americans opposed involvement in the war, but they really supported the Allied cause. You know, Britain was a longtime ally, and we were very closely connected to them. 70% of Americans wanted to help Britain win, even at the cost of going to war themselves. And they changed their mind a little bit after the Lend-Lease Act. However, what happened in December of 1941 settled the question for good, as on December 7th, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, thus causing no further question about the United States entering World War II. So that information is going to help you with your World War II or War Again, your essay. Some of those, the Lend-Lease Act, Cash and Carry Neutrality Acts, are things that you're going to need to discuss. The next assignment is a reading comprehension activity. There's text embedded in the Google Doc that you will open, and it will force you to make a copy, and there's comprehension questions embedded in it. So basically you will be reading all about World War II and how, kind of right in chronological order, how we became involved in the war, what happened with Pearl Harbor. And like I said, the questions are actually embedded right into the text, and you will make your own copy, and you'll just submit that whole copy to me so you can answer right within the document. And that way you can kind of go back and forth and reread as you need to. And then finally, the last assignment is, and as you can probably tell with aggressors in being Germany and Japan, there were distinct areas or theaters of battle. I'm asking you to read the Canvas text on 2 wars that is linked in the module. However, you are not to do the quiz, but instead you have a discussion question response where you're basically responding to the text. I want you to highlight 3 major differences between the European theater and the Pacific theater. I want to make sure that you include specific place names, specific military leaders, and specific battles in your response. Don't forget, there's instructional support daily, and live lessons are on Friday. If you have any questions, feel free to inbox me.